Hi, Greg. How you doing tonight?
Hello, Hugh.
Remember, we were talking about the Indian chief that murdered my family member yesterday. He lived in the Fox home after Carmela Fox moved on. He was from Massachusetts, and around when I was around 28 years old, he knocked on my front door, maybe 26. That would have been around 1979, 1980. I think it was 1978. He knocked on my front door, said hello, an Indian from Massachusetts. And he had a gun in his hand. And it was a gun that you would load with black powder, in a wad and put a lead ball in it.
hmm
And he said, "Hi, you don't know me, but this has been sitting in my family's lodge for the past 250 years or so. And it's your family's gun from a Massachusetts colony. My ancestor killed your ancestors in their home and took their guns. And they kept this gun as a trinket from the murders." And he handed the gun to me. And when I opened the gun up, it had been manufactured in the 1700s. It had my name on it, Harris. And he gave me the gun. He said, "Here, this is your gun. You should have it." And then he was dating an Italian girl who lived down the street from the guy that was best man at my wedding, a guy by the name of Dale Eplet. And he was best man at my second wedding to Mary Westhouse. And about 2 years after that chief moved into the Carmela Fox home, and there's a story in Carmela Fox I'll tell you in a little bit. Um, I moved down the road to a bigger farm I bought from Lazar. It was 7 square miles, and I stopped a drug trade in Utica, Michigan on that farm. And I had that gun in my home. And when I stopped that drug dealer, some people tried to murder me. And the only person I knew to call in that area near 26 Mile was the guy that was best man at my wedding. He lived on a farm about 2 miles from me. And I called him and I told him I'm in trouble because they were shooting at me and had broken into my home. The drug dealers I stopped. And they shoved a bunch of drugs down my throat. And tried to kill me. Uh, Dale arrived at my home and called the police, and he told the police I tried to kill myself. And I didn't. The drug dealers I stopped attempted to murder me. Um, when he told the police that I killed myself, he took my gun. And that gun was from the 1700s in Massachusetts in the original colony where George Washington gave my family his sword in the first Mason's Lodge. And you discovered that in the cemetery next to your house in Ohio, Marietta. What is it, Marietta Cemetery? Or
hmm
yeah, you discovered that when you were researching the Indian mounds in Ohio. So my gun was never returned, and I know that Applet took it because I was in his house. They failed in trying to kill me, and several weeks later, I was in my best man's house, and there was my gun laying on his kitchen table. He forgot to hide it. And because he was best man at my wedding, I didn't say anything to him. I figured he'd return it one day feeling guilty. That was over, that happened in 1979, 1980. So that's over 43 years ago, and he never returned the gun. So, and that gun became the Smith and Wesson Company. I'm also the Smith family from that same original colony. But back then, Harris would forge the gun barrels and then they'd put them on wooden stocks, and they were what the world called a blunderbuss. So he took a gun that was worth millions of dollars to me, never gave it back. And I'm pretty sure he's dead now. If he's still alive, maybe he'll send it back to me if he ever sees this video, but I don't think he's alive anymore. Because he was 20 years older than me. So he lied to the police in Macomb County, told them I tried to kill myself after drug dealers attempted to murder me, and he stole my gun. That an Indian chief from Massachusetts in the 1700s looked me up. After all those years, he found me, looked me up, and knocked on my front door on 26 Mile and Van Dyke next to a park called Stony Creek at the edge of Beldman Drive. And it figures that my best man would steal a gun like that from me. My best friend in life, and my best friends in my own family stole my inheritance. And one of my brothers and sister, one of my sisters attempted to kill me. And my whole family stole my Bottom Line publishing company from me, not knowing I was a publisher. And not one of my 600 family members or my various friends told me that they were stealing my business. And I know this in hindsight, looking back, because I owned the Bottom Line band and we were being played on the radio, and I had contracts with Gene, a milkman who built lounges, and Decker's Landing. My cousin Puckett, the world used to know Gary Puckett and Union Gap. Well, Leah Puckett was my cousin, and she put my band under contract in a bar called Decker's Landing. And back then, her and her husband owned Merlite Jewelry. And then they moved down to Florida. And so Dale stole a gun from me that was worth a whole lot of money. It was Smith and Wesson before they became Smith and Wesson. And the Harris family was forging the steel for the gun barrels. And if you ever see this, Dale, you should call me and send it back to me. It's a museum piece. It should be in Greg's museum with the sword Washington handed my family. And then we went on to talk about the fox home that Indian chief eventually ended up in. I went to high school in Warren High. And I would do my homework with Sandra Locke, Carmela Fox, Judy Preswera, and Sue Baldwin. And this was back in 1965, 66. I was in high school. And we'd all go home and do our homework together at the Fox home, an Indian family there on Chicago Road. Across the street from the home I would have owned on Beebe Street if I hadn't divorced Mary Westhouse, another Indian. Um, and I divorced Mary after her and her father and mother attempted to murder me and put me in jail with Whitey as they murdered Jimmy Hoffa. And then Sandra Locke is a real good girlfriend of mine back then. Her brother Joe Locke, Sandra Locke. And Clint Eastwood got his first Western movie back then. And he married Sandra Locke in Mount Carmel, Carmela Fox. And his movies marked my life. And nobody on earth knows this other than me. And that's because Ava Gardner made the first TV series on earth, Make Room for Daddy, and she was my great aunt. And she married Frank Sinatra, and I became a publisher. In Warren, Michigan, they marked me in ways where, like Taxi in New York, Danny DeVito, a police detective at Warren High was put in charge of protecting me when I was about 15 years old because two people at my church attempted to murder me and stole my car and then went and stole an airplane for drugs that Mary Westhouse eventually ended up with. Mary Westhouse, she never stopped dealing drugs. I kept asking her to stop dealing drugs because they were illegal in Michigan. And back then you could go to jail for 30 years for one joint. And we had 5 kids together. And she never stopped bringing pounds of weed into my house via the people that attempted to murder me. And then Mary went to Warren High, but 12 years prior to me. And we mentioned in other videos, her cousin Cook married my brother-in-law, Tony, who was a drill instructor at Fort Knox and a captain and a commander at Fort Knox. And then 3 hours later came to me and tried to have sex with me after marrying my brother-in-law. And all of that was planned because Joe Jacobs was my father-in-law, married to Nancy Fredericks, whose father before him was mayor of East Detroit, where all the rockers come from. Perry and Cook are Apple CEOs, and back then, when the guy who started Apple was alive, they all lived in Michigan, and they were spying on me because I taught electronics to people who worked at the Abrams tank plant in Warren Consolidated, and Jim Garrison was my alumni there at Warren Consolidated. And they marked me with Danny DeVito when the little dwarf, I come home from work one day and teaching, and that police detective that went to Warren High, who was supposed to protect me, was having sex with my wife in front of my daughter in a high chair on the kitchen floor. And I turned around and walked out, and he was a dwarf. So he would fit in with the students at Warren High. And he was a lot older than me. And that's when Westhouse and Cook and Perry jumped into my life and married my brother-in-law and then came and tried to have sex with me 3 hours later. So they could spy on what I was designing for the auto companies, robots and computers for General Motors, Ford's, Chrysler's, at Christensen Corporation. And Christensen built the Guidestones. So Apple immediately came into my life, and they hated my wife, Nancy, because the biker gang that they were president and met on their farm where they buried Jimmy Hoffa. was Apple Computer. And her cousins were Cook and Perry, and they run Apple now. But I would design things like heated backlights to test windshields in the back and the back window for the heated element. And they would test them real quick on the lines, and they stole things like that and gave them to the world as stud finders and became millionaires spying on me when I married Mary Westhouse, their cousin. And that was Apple Computers spying on me because Bill Gates is my cousin via the Gardner family. I grew up with the Gates family. Gates taught me how to reload the shells for my own guns. Or I'm sorry, Gates taught me how to use guns and rifles. And my friend Butler, who ran the CIA, taught me how to reload the shells for the guns. So the Gates family taught me how to shoot a gun, and then the head of the CIA in Chicago taught me how to reload the bullets for my guns. And I've never been a convicted felon, but the government has always denied me gun ownership. And they've done this consecutively since Gates taught me how to use a gun. And they still do it to this day, but I'm not a felon. So they have no right to do that. But they do it. So anyways, Sandra Locke married Clint Eastwood. And in Carmel, as I sat and did my homework with Sandra Locke and Carmela Fox. And this is not coincidence. I also worked for Morrison, who was John Wayne's family, driving truck in Hoffa's Union, and Jimmy Hoffa is my family member because his son married into the Harris family, and I'm the Harris family. So everything I say, I know what I'm talking about. More so than any news has ever told any of you. And then the other girl there was Judy Presswera. And then I got Huey Lewis stealing my name as they stole my trademark, Huey Lewis in the news. Her name was Presswera. One of the singers in my band, Bottom Line, Danny Harold, was murdered coming back from Florida. What's the Herald is the town crier. He delivers the news, as you got Huey Lewis. And I never told you that before, but it's true. Danny Harold was murdered coming back from Florida. And then my mother's brother Harold was murdered when my mother was 7. So all the Harolds in my life were murdered, and then the world got Huey Lewis stealing my name, coming from France, is my trademark Bottom Line, from a federal court in New York, was stolen by the Foley family. Foley Federal Court gave me my publishing license. And you recently read a story on Wikipedia that says Irving Berlin created the Bourne Publishing Company, and that's not truth. Mr. Bourne created the Bourne Publishing Company and featured Elvis, and Irving Berlin was a composer in New York that we published. I was one of his publishers, and Bourne was one of his publishers. Whoever wrote the Wikipedia article doesn't know what they're talking about. Irving Berlin was a very famous composer at ASCAP in New York that we would feature in our publications. And I showed you a magazine about Irving Berlin earlier, right from ASCAP, New York, back in 1960, when Elvis was at his height in Vegas, and my family wrote songs that Elvis sang. So that was Judy Presswera. And the Detroit News stole my trademark as 2,500 corporations, with DuPont stole my trademark, and they all did this on the same day after murdering me. And that's why that Warren, Michigan detective was supposed to protect me at my school when I was married to the mayor of East Detroit's daughter, and her stepfather was Joe Jacobs of IBM. And he gave Gates the software to make his computer at my wedding to Nancy when I was 15 in about 1965, 66. And the reason I married Nancy is because she was 5 years older than me and she raped me. And then she came back and told me she was pregnant and she wanted me to give her money to abort my child. And I told her, no, I'll marry you. So I married her and raised a kid. And when that happened, when I walked in on her, I left and I come back the next day and she took off and went and lived with that policeman in Warren, Michigan for a period of 2 weeks. And I'm sure they had sex for 2 weeks. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, that policeman sent her back to me because he was supposed to be protecting me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the world got Taxi and Danny DeVito. Vi is my sister-in-law. Dan raped my daughter, and you got Dan D. Vi too in Taxi, who looked just like a Warren, Michigan policeman, same size, a dwarf. And they marked me like that as my sister-in-law ran off with a guy named Joe after 30 years of marriage to my half-brother. And none of these things are coincidence. They were all done on purpose by the Warren police and the Oakland County police trying to make up for hiding my kidnap and torture in 57 on the day they murdered Admiral Byrd. Those two police forces covered up murders of kids, murder of a county judge at Selfridge Air Force Base, the murder of a psychiatrist. After my daughter was kidnapped off her bus, I got her a psychiatrist, took her to him once. And while we sat in the office, the newspaper said he died of a heart attack jogging down the road. And the whole story was a lie, but he was dead 5 minutes after I and my daughter left his office. And then Judge Hunter Stare was dead leaving Selfridge, and Judge Hunter Stare had given me custody of my daughter. So I know that these things are interrelated with me divorcing the family that really murdered Jimmy Hoffa. And I know they really murdered Jimmy Hoffa because they set me up with Whitey. Two women, one was 12 years older than me and the other one was 30 years older than me, set me up with Whitey. He sold me a car a month prior to the 55-year-old woman being Hoffa's guest at the Sly Fox. She was with him when he disappeared. And then the FBI came to my house because I had to junk the car Whitey gave to me because the transmission broke down. And they set all this up the month before, so they had to know they were going to disappear Hoffa in order to do all of this. So at that point, I divorced her. And her father took a night scope and a rifle when I went to pick up my kids on his farm after I got out of work. I worked 2 jobs. I would teach and go to another job, and then I would drive trucks. So I actually had 3 jobs. Supporting 5 kids, and only one of them was mine. I went to pick my kid and wife up and the other 4 kids, and her father pointed a night scope at me as I stood over the hole he had just buried Jimmy Hoffa in. And this is not a pipe dream. This is the truth of what they did with my relative, Jimmy Hoffa. And then that morning, the FBI had detained me for Jimmy Hoffa's murder in front of all my kids in my Troy, Michigan driveway as I got back from Detroit driving truck for Morrison. So I know all of this is true, but they won't tell my story. And if I call the FBI, they just hang up on me. They never take any credible reports about murdered people in my life. If I call them about murdered kids taken across state lines, the girls at the front desks hang up on me. And these are real kids, and they were really murdered. People like Timmy King, President Ford's family. President Ford's real name was King and Gardner, my family. It wasn't Ford. They murdered Timmy King and threw him on my family's property. I'm the Gardner family. They would kidnap kids off of Gardner Street and then dump them on our property. And they never took reports. They didn't put this in the news. The picture on the front page of the news was my little brother's car, who played bass guitar in my band, a little gremlin. And they said this was the suspect they were looking for. And all of this was done by the family that really murdered Hoffa. And it goes all the way back to 57 on the day when they murdered not Jimmy Hoffa, when they murdered Admiral Byrd. My mother was his nurse. And that was her family member. She told me he was murdered. They told you he died of a heart attack. My mother always strongly disagreed with that. And my mother and my father were both in the Navy. And the girl I married, her mother, who was with Hoffa, was in the Navy. And I've had 4 wives murdered. And their fathers all served in the Navy with my father under Admiral Byrd and with John F. Kennedy in the Navy during World War II. These things are not coincidence. They didn't give any of my murdered wives an obituary, didn't even discuss the murders. They dismembered. 3 of the girls were dismembered, and they were all murdered on holidays, Christmas, July 4th, Halloween. And they were all dismembered and murdered on a holiday. After I found them dead on my Civil War ranch, revived them and flew them to hospitals, they were murdered a second time. And I bet my whole life through, Oakland and Macomb County tried to tell me I stopped a drug trade, an illegal Senate drug and gun trade on my farm. They were people living behind me in worker homes on the farm I purchased from Mazar, selling drugs. And they were getting the drugs from the Senate. And the Senate was giving guns to the Mexican cartels, and they've been doing this since Oswald was framed for murdering Kennedy. Oswald called Russia from Mexico. They were picking up or delivering guns and picking up drugs. And the news told everybody he was getting his drugs from Cuba. That's a lie. He was getting his drugs from Mexico because that's how they paid for the guns when they didn't have enough money. And when they murdered and kidnapped my daughter, when they murdered Kiki on Christmas Day and kidnapped my daughter after raping her in front of my kid, and she was Ricky Nelson's cousin, and her sister was on the cover of Maybelline. That's when Mae Musk took over the cover of Maybelline and named Ellen Musk. She was making fun of me because I was the L. I was the bottom line, and they gave you Dateline, Nightline, and all these lines as they stole my trademark bottom line out of a federal court in New York, and they even stole my IRS licenses and my whole name, Huey Francis Squire. The Pope took my middle name. You got Huey Lewis and Billy Squire. One of them come from France, the other one came from Germany, and then the Pope in Rome took my middle name as I stopped Noriega's drugs.
The IRS theft is really what kept you from being able to publish music anymore, right? Because then you couldn't do your taxes.
What's that?
Would you say that the IRS
theft? The IRS wouldn't give me proper identification to file taxes in every country on earth, and they did this to me over and over 100 times. they would spell my name wrong or my business name wrong or give me a wrong tax ID number. I called them in 1 week. I called them over 100 times trying to get proper tax forms to file taxes. And when you're a worldwide publisher, you got to file taxes on a weekly basis. So when they started stealing my IRS licenses, my federal licenses, I stopped publishing. Because I always paid my taxes and I always did things legally. And just like now, I know exactly who dismembered, raped, and murdered my wives. I know who did that, but I won't walk up and knock on the door and shoot them. I could very easily. I choose to go through the police, but the police, because they were part of the murders, the White House and Senate hired police to murder my family 5 times since my birth. There's no lie in this.
It's
But none of
interesting
this,
that you mentioned Dateline, Hugh, because here in our town, just a mile from where I am, there was a girl who was murdered just this month, and who was on Dateline, and I just found that fascinating too. I assume she was murdered.
they always mark my life with murders, and it's always on shows like Dateline. The people that kidnapped me were Wallace Osborne, Anderson, Andrews, Long. They were all governors, and Darrell Hall. And the people that kidnapped me and murdered my twin, they've marked me my entire life through the senator's media. Like in Michigan, where I was kidnapped and they murdered my twin, Graham owns the media. So they never say my truth. And then Roseanne Barr and Kathy O'Brien pretended they were my truth as they worked on TV and radio for Graham.
Yep, yeah. And Holt runs Dateline. He's the anchor on Dateline, and then
Holt was Cher's mother, and Holt was a detective who didn't file my wife's murder, and she was dismembered. Her ears were cut off, and then her throat was slit Halloween Eve. And Holt never filed my wife's murder. Right. They called missing ears and a slit throat and a sodomized woman in a wheelchair natural causes. And the Holt family is part of that. And right. That's Sonny and Cher's mother. And you got Sonny and Cher. Think about this, Greg. I'm a drummer. I'm the Baker family. You got Ginger Baker playing double bass drums. I was a drummer in Michigan playing double bass drums in the 60s and 50s. I was on the radio just like Ginger Baker. You got Sonny and Cher when Nancy married me. I was 15. You got Sonny and Cher. Sonny became mayor of a city on the West Coast. Cher's mother was Holt. Nancy, my wife's father, was mayor of East Detroit, where you got all the rock and roll music. Ted Nugent, Alice Cooper, B-52s, Ramones, they all came out of East Detroit. All the white rocker. Detroit was Motown and the black musicians, the jazz musicians in Motown, and East Detroit was all the white musicians. You got Sonny and Cher, and Sonny was mayor as Nancy, shortly after Nancy married me, and I began to raise my daughter, who was born out of wedlock. She was my daughter because Nancy had raped me in the back seat of her mother's car when I was 15. And Nancy at that time was in her 20s. And then Cook came and they hated Nancy because she escaped the bikers that put her in a motel room in Mount Clemens. And they were gangbanging her. She escaped and put a bunch of them in jail. And this is the mayor of East Detroit's daughter. And then Cook was Westhouse's cousins, and Cook came and married her brother and then came right to me and gave me oral sex and tried to have sex with me. On the afternoon, she married my brother-in-law. And this was all done on purpose so they could spy on me because Nancy's then father, Jacobs, gave Gates the software from IBM to interface DOS with a TV screen. Uh, Apple, I forget that guy's name, but all these people lived right where I lived. And I actually, Gates' partner, Lou Allen and the guy Cronin who interfaced the first computers with TVs, they all worked with me at Christensen's as Christensen built the Guidestones. And all of this is interrelated. And they Cook set me up so Westhouse could walk into my life and marry me. And they did that because they hated Nancy, because they put the renegades in prison for gangbanging her in a motel room. They tied her to a bed and gangbanged her. She escaped them and took them to court. So they hated my wife. You understand this? And my wife wasn't the smartest cookie in the box because she was the first heart transplant on earth. She was born in New York, and they cut her open and gave her an artificial heart the day she was born because her mother had German measles. She's medical history in New York. She was the very first heart transplant. And it wasn't a real heart, it was a mechanical heart. And she lived to be in her 60s. And they murdered her on the day they let the Bundys out of jail when Trump was president. And that's a whole nother story that we've discussed before. That has to do with Ted Bundy and my own kidnap in the murders of the Oakland County kids. And
Yeah, they took off her leg and gave her the leg lamb.
Cooper raping my daughter and kidnapping my daughter with Hill off her school bus when she was 7.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no lie in any of this. So we go back to Judy Priswera and Sandra Locke, and everybody's got a Locke fire extinguisher, and all the fire departments across the whole country use a Locke fire extinguisher. And Clint Eastwood married Sandra Locke and Carmel, as I did my homework with Sandra Locke and Carmela Fox. And this is not coincidence. And it's because of things like George Washington gave my family his sword. Where?
Right at Marietta.
The sword is in the museum in Marietta.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the Putnam and Fuller and Harris families.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know the location where he gave it to him, but yeah.
It was in the First Masons Lodge.
Probably.
So my family's the first Masons in the country. Interesting. And then I'm A.S. Cap. I'm Squire Cap, which is seeing eye in the pyramid. And I'm the bottom line, the foundation stone. And they stole my trademark bottom line right out of the Library of Congress. Weiner and Clinton did that. And I got that. I hired Weiner and Associates to protect my trademark bottom line. And then they turned it into a book that every lawyer in the country studied out of to pass the bar exam. And they did that over when I was 15, 16 years old. What year was it when I was 16? I wasn't even 16.
69.
Yeah, I was 15. I don't even think it was 69. 63, I would have been 10. Yeah, it would have been 1969. They stole the trademark. I hired Weiner and Associates to protect, and Weiner and Associates was in front of Dire Straits' home on Telegraph Road. The guy that wrote Telegraph Road. And right in front of his house was Weiner and Associates on Telegraph Road. And I was there because I was with George Towers from Warren High School, my music teacher, and we had just performed across the street. I walked across the street and hired the attorney to protect my trademark. Instead, Weiner ran off and married Aberdeen, and then he was put in jail for showing his penis to minors all over the internet. That's who stole my trademark with DuPont and 2,500 corporations. And I say I was 15, but it might have been even, I think it was 67 when I was 13 or 14, because I was put in Warren High and Del Towers was my chorus teacher, and I played drums for his chorus. The chorus needed a band so they could perform. So I could have been 13 years old, and then that would have been 67 when they stole my trademark.
Mhm.
So from let's say it was 67, and I'd already been playing for years as bottom line in bars for people in my family who built bars. And these were huge clubs in Detroit, outside of Detroit and in Detroit. I played for the NFL linebackers. My girlfriend was Anthionetta Washington. Both her brothers were linebackers for the Chicago Bears. So I played in Chicago with Bottom Line. And this was back in 65, 66. And they stole my trademark. As I became a publisher, my own family helped the people who kidnapped me at 4 and beat my twin to death. My whole family helped them steal my trademark by stealing my business. When they stole my business, that's when my trademark was stolen all over the globe, and my name. And that was no small theft. That publishing license, bottom line, was worth $3 trillion back then. You witnessed one song I published. What was it? Was in the Joker movie.
The
Send in
Sin
the
and the
Clowns.
Clowns. Mhm.
Back then, it was an $80 million contract. They got over $100 million for the Joker movie to use it. And then Stephen Sondheim just died. I was his publisher. And I was publisher for 28,000 people just like him. Irving Berlin, Elvis Presley, Mitch Ryder, Styx. I played with Styx. I played with Wayne Newton's musicians. I played
Badfinger
with
too.
Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas. I played in the restaurants they own. All these people know me, and they all know I was their publisher, but nobody steps forward and helps me after they murdered my whole family 5 times. And that's including kids. They murdered the kids in my family. They murdered 5 of my kids in 2017 when I sat just before L. Brooks Patterson died. I was sitting in his office on the day I was sitting in his office, telling him that Daryl Hall and Osborne and Long and Anderson and Andrews and Wallace kidnapped me and tortured me and beat my twin to death. As I sat in his office before he died, they murdered 5 of my kids that day.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no news. They gave you Dr. Nasser, a doctor looking at college women's vaginas. He's supposed to do that. They keep giving you fake news and hiding my truth. And my truth is who really killed the Kennedys.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that all goes back to Sandra Locke, Carmela Fox, Judy Presswera, and there was one other girl, Sue Baldwin. I saved Sue Baldwin from the same bikers. They were going to kidnap her and gangbang her. And I got the heck kicked out of me by the bikers. And that was my second wife's family, the Westhouse family, and the Renegades again. And I saved Sue Baldwin, and she was my friend at Warren High, and I was 14, 15 years old. And we would do our homework together with Sandra Locke, Judy Prisuera, Carmela Fox. And that's when Clint Eastwood married Sandra Locke. when I met Sandra Locke in Michigan at Warren High. And this is my brother-in-law's family was Mitch Ryder. Elvis was singing those songs right from Warren High. Good golly, Miss Molly, Devil with the Blue Dress On. That's my family. And Peterson is Elvira. Peterson was my assistant principal and the guy who was giving me advice as to what college to go to. I forget what you call that. But that's the jobs he had at my high school. Peterson, Elvira's family. And then they gave you Elvira as my sister-in-law Vi ran off with Joe to Florida.
You're like a counselor, I think, right?
Yeah, a counselor. That's correct. And Peterson shot his own kid in the back of the head, duck hunting. And then when they murdered Terry and Vicky in Tennessee, they put the Duck Dynasty on stage with the National Guard and on TV. And then they gave you the Perrys, who are West House family, with the National Guard. And they said nothing about my murdered wives, murdered on a Civil War ranch owned by Manning. And they gave you Chelsea Manning as Tom Garrett at CBS and Walters from CBS. Walters was my wife's advocate in the hospital. And they used my advocate's phone to tell me they murdered my wife. Right from her bedroom in the hospital. They screamed to me as they cut my wife's ears off. And that was the Walters phone, and Walters was her advocate. Now, how did Walters' phone get to the people that murdered my wife in the hospital? As Tom Garrett destroyed my income and helped murder my attorney, I hired, Alexa, stop. Tom Garrett destroyed my online income from his White House office in Obama's government and helped murder my attorney. And they destroyed my income so I couldn't hire another attorney. My attorney was on his way to file murder charges for my wife and Terry Heath. Terry Heath is Sarah Heath Palin's family. They murdered her as the election started. Then they murdered Victoria, Halloween Eve. Do you understand this, Greg?
Yeah.
And then everybody tries to tell me I'm crazy, and I'm not crazy.
Right.
The government took away my ability to work.
Mm-hmm.
They took away all my driving licenses, and I don't have a single accident or ticket. They did that the day I moved off of that civil rights farm because I didn't want to live where they murdered my wives. I loved them. And I moved here to the West Coast. And the family that offered me a place to stay on the West Coast, they also served in the Navy, just like my wives. And Admiral Byrd is my family member, and my best friend at Warren High ran the CIA in Chicago at Great Lakes Naval Base. I'm not crazy. I'm the truth of Kennedy's murder, Hoffa's murder, Tim McVeigh, and a whole lot of other things like 9/11. They blew up my civil rights case on 9/11 in the Pentagon office. They blew up. And there was no plane there. They showed you a Mack engine, and gee, I'm a truck driver, and they had just murdered Jimmy Hoffa and arrested me for his murder. Chucky O'Brien is my family member because my family member Hoffa raised him. That's Dr. O'Brien and Kathy O'Brien, who work for Barr, or not Barr, Barr and Kathy O'Brien and Osborne, the family that kidnapped me. They work for Senator Graham's family. Graham owns Michigan Media, where I was kidnapped and the kids were murdered. And they've been covering all this up my entire life. And they're still covering it up. And that's why you read stories like Irving Berlin started Born Publishing Company.
Right.
This is all, they're changing names and dates, and they're brainwashing each generation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a real ASCAP publisher, and I met with the owner of Born Publishing.
Yeah.
I met with the Mills brothers. I met with real publishers. I met with Dee Snider of Twisted Sister before he even existed. And, you know, Dee Snider is whose friend? He made a Santa Claus movie.
Oh, right. Foley. Yeah.
Oh, and what did Foley make? Santa Claus used to rape me when I was a kid at Divco at Twin Pines
Mm-hmm.
and at my public school. Santa Claus was a janitor. He was also a college professor. He would rape me.
That needs to be a
Mick,
whole nother video sometime, but yeah, that's
Mick Foley. Mick
good.
Foley, he made a movie about he's Santa Claus. And the first Santa Claus in the movie is right at the house I bought my mother and father when I was 12 years old on Viceroy Drive in Sterling Heights.
Yeah.
They stole
Yep.
my entire life. He even named his kids after my family's kids, Mickey
Yeah.
and Hugh.
Yeah, you and your brother right there. That's unbelievable.
And
And
then
his
he earned
oldest,
all his money at Bottom Line Events, my stolen trademark.
Mickey and Huey, just like you and your brother. It's unreal.
Yep. Yeah.
And
And
then
he
even
earned,
his middle name is Francis, like
yeah,
yours.
yep. No, I'm
It's
well aware of all that.
unbelievable.
Yeah. And
In his movie about gay Santa Claus, and the first Santa Claus, that one wasn't gay, but that one was from Sterling Heights, and it goes straight from that one to
yeah, they murdered
the
little
gay
kids
Santa.
all around me, Greg, for 70 years. 70 years. They murdered little
Mhm.
kids all around me. And I mean
Yeah,
dozens of little kids.
I know.
And gay Santas would rape me when I was 4 years old. They beat my twin to death.
Right. That was
Changed
not the most pleasant movie that you've had me
Camille
research.
Sirhan. With Camille Sirhan, they brought my twin to me. And
Hmm.
Wallace's classroom when I was in kindergarten. And
Yeah.
the principal was the Long family, Huey P. Long, Wallace, Governor Wallace,
Mhm.
Osborne, Governor Osborne of Michigan. Sue Baldwin, I did my homework with. Baldwin would run against Osborne to be governor on many occasions back in the 1890s, 1900s.
Hmm.
Baldwin was my friend. Osborne raped me and murdered my
Right.
twin.
Right.
And the drug dealers, Blanchard lived right behind me in one of the worker homes. Did absolutely nothing to stop the illegal Senate gun and drug trade.
That's another Michigan governor family.
Another Michigan governor. So all of these people know me, and I have letters written to me from them all, and you know this. I've scanned them on Facebook. So
Well, we should probably stop it there. It's getting pretty late.
yeah.
So I'm gonna.
So this was about Sue Baldwin. I saved her from a bunch of bikers that were going to gang rape her.
Mhm.
She was 14, 15 years old. She was my friend. And then when they murdered Hoffa, Hoffa was sitting with my mother-in-law, Lou, and I'm Hugh. And my family gave you internet and computers. And Netflix hired Alec Baldwin
Oh,
on Hugh Lou. And I was playing at Alex's brass bell at the town clock in Utica, Michigan, as I stopped the illegal gun and drug trade run by the Senate and CIA.
right. And then Hall, one of the rapists' families, gives Baldwin a gun on Rust. Unreal.
Right. And he murdered his director. That's correct. And then you called Baldwin's attorneys and they didn't even return your call, did they?
Nope. Called twice. Talked to the
Yep.
secretary both times.
And then I was kidnapped with Camille Sirhan and my twin. 11 years before they framed Sirhan for Bobby's murder.
Well, he hasn't returned any letters either, and I even give him stamped envelope and everything to send it back.
No, they never will, because this is a big CIA cover-up of my life. And I'm all the presidents on your money. I'm Lincoln, Jackson, Morgan, Grant, Chase. Those are my family members.
You went to
From
school with
the
him too, which is amazing.
yeah, from the original colonies. I bought my first car from Hamilton on year 10. I would pick them up and go to my church.
Yeah,
Grant,
well, your teacher was actually Hamilton, the one that called herself Wallace. It was related to Wallace. That her real
I
name
went
was
to school with
Hamilton.
Lincoln. My
Mhm.
family ran forts.
Yeah. Then you had
Lincoln,
Harris at Ford's
Lincoln's
Theater.
guest at Ford Theater was Harris. I'm Harris,
Yeah.
but I don't
That was on,
exist. And
and
Biden's
Harris was on the Blunderbuss gun. Man,
yeah,
this is all,
yeah. And Biden's not replacing me with black people.
yeah.
Remember, he
Yeah,
went on
unbelievable.
TV. He said there's no replacement theory, and I never said there was. All I've done is made videos and said the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But they want to replace me with a black girl in a 20. They've already replaced me in the White House with
Yeah,
Harris,
with
who's
Harris.
not my family. And they replaced me in the Supreme Court with Jackson. And I'm the Jackson family on your 20. So Biden is lying to everybody, and they won't allow me on the news. Nobody interviews me. I got my whole family's been murdered 5 times, including kids. It's just unbelievable. But we'll end it there, Greg. I went to school with Sandra Locke and Carmela Fox, as Clint Eastwood married Sandra Locke and Carmel. And the Holt was the detective who didn't file my wife's murder charges after she was dismembered and her throat slit Halloween Eve. I met with her every day for 3 weeks. Her boss pulled her off my case, and if I call with more information about my wife's murder, Detective Holt never existed.
Right.
And that's Sonny and Cher's mother. I'm the biggest cover up on earth, Greg.
Definitely.
You take care. I'll send
Okay.
this to you.
You too, you.
I'll send this to you in the mail.
Okay.